Hey everybody, we are going to be starting in just a moment. We have a few panelists that are stuck in the waiting room that we're going to pull in. And so just sorting through the riffraff here and getting that together. I will go through the different ways you can engage with the webinar. And we've decided to forego slides and have just made a Medium page to make it easier for people to have things. Right now, the Medium page doesn't have clickable links, but you can use this link right at the top, mediamanipulation.shorensteincenter.org, to find all of the recent work that TASK, the Technology and Social Change Research Project, has been doing at the Shorenstein Center. We have a newsletter called Me More Weekly. We have this webinar called Big If True. We are going to be releasing a whole slew of research in the coming weeks on media manipulation, disinformation related to COVID-19. And so that is going to be really exciting. A little bit of housekeeping. This is a webinar and there's no attendee audio or video available. Unfortunately, due to Zoom bombing and the nature of the work that we do, we don't want anybody to encounter any of the horrible things that one might see as a result of Zoom bombing and pranking. So we're just going to have to roll with this for now, but we will try to answer your questions as they come up through the Q&A feature. So use that at the bottom of your screen. And then there's also a chat feature where you can chat to all of the panelists. And the Forum Network is also live streaming this live to YouTube. So I am a YouTuber now, which is very exciting. I get to say that and not be ironic about it. Today's speakers are unreal. As some of them, I am privileged to be able to call them friends and sisters. And so one of the things that has been really difficult for all of us to understand in this moment, of course, is how are platforms managing during the pandemic, given the fact that their workforce has obviously had to stay at home as well. And we have a couple of experts that are going to be able to tell you really the ins and outs of how content moderation happens and for what reasons and where breakdowns occur in the infrastructure, all the real nerdy nerd stuff that we all like to talk about. Sofia Noble, who's written really a book that is path-breaking, Algorithms of Oppression. She's been touring the world pretty much, giving lectures, letting everybody know what her research is bearing out, but also is someone who's really in the thick of it at the front lines, trying to turn research into action. And we also have Sarah Roberts, who has another amazing, really detailed ethnographic book called Behind the Screen, which is the first of its kind to really catalog and understand the internal life worlds, the social worlds of content moderators, and how the work that they do is fundamental to the experience you get on the internet. And she's, like Sofia, both are at University of California at Los Angeles, and they're the co-directors for the UCLA Center for Critical Internet Inquiry. And then last but not least, we have Elizabeth Dwoskin, who I met a few years ago at a conference and have just been wrapped by her reporting over the years on Silicon Valley. Really someone who digs deep to get the stories and also is a compassionate listener to those who have been harmed by sort of the rolling technology. I'm picturing here like, a kind of plow that's just tilling the fields, but not really caring about what it rakes up in the consequences of their actions. And so Elizabeth's work has been really foundational for uncovering some of these really important tech stories. Next week, we're going to talk about the trouble with science. And we have a science reporter that I've been really enjoying her work, Jane Hu. She's been writing at Slate about herd immunity and all of these other kinds of scientific misinformation campaigns. And then we have a couple of YouTube popular science communicators, Greg and Mitch from ASAP Science. And if you haven't seen any of their videos, go check them out. They're really great at breaking down complex scientific issues to the core and the essence of them. So without further ado, I am going to get into talking with our panelists. I'm going to stop this screen share. And on the background there, the people at Shorenstein are going to be able to set up to make sure that everybody can see everyone. And yeah, welcome everyone. I'm going to unmute everyone here so that we all can chat together. How's it going?
Great. Good morning. Good afternoon.
Good.
Great to see you all.
I think so. From just the 30,000 foot view, I would love to know sort of where y'all heads are at with understanding what's happening in content moderation. We will, during the course of this hour, go back in time and talk more about the machina and the gradations. But if you could just give people a sort of quick teaser about what you're seeing now that is important for people to recognize and understand. And we can start with Sarah, because I know you've recently been writing about this.
Yeah, thanks so much, Joan, for having me. I'm really excited to be with a group of phenomenal women. That's always a great way to kick it off. So thanks for doing this. Where we are in this moment is, of course, like so many other things, unprecedented. A couple of weeks, like just prior to really the American lockdown, let's say, the American kind of movement towards quarantine, I was talking to a reporter colleague, and we were kind of speculating about how the potential of a global pandemic might affect commercial content moderation. And it became pretty clear to me early on, and I did put a piece up on the Flow TV journal, and then later wrote in Slate, but the earlier piece was in Flow, that I thought that there were going to be some pretty significant changes to status quo. And so for everyone who's here, just to give you kind of a very basic concept of what that looked like prior, the social media industry relies upon legions of globalized workers who are dispersed all over the world. In typically now it's for the major platforms, a series of their own kind of branded call centers that are often run by third parties. And that industry is consolidated such that those third parties who manage the centers might be major transnational corporations themselves that are in labor provision. And it's hard to have numbers around how many people we're talking about, but we're certainly talking about documented tens of thousands. I think the number's larger. I think we're in the six figures. But particularly, there's a particular concentration of people who do this work, like I said, across the globe. They're in the United States, but they're also in places like the Philippines. And it's important for participants to know that the Philippines is actually a key site for all kinds of labor that's outsourced from North America. But it is especially important in the context of commercial content moderation. This is because of a multitude of reasons that I'm sure we'll talk about. And so as the pandemic was kind of spreading around the globe, and that itself was an iterative sort of process that didn't occur all at once, we began to speculate, and I began to think about what it would look like if, for example, those call centers were no longer able to operate. In other words, those laborers were not able to coalesce in their workplace and be on site to do the work of commercial content moderation, which in a generalist context is it's a live production environment. It's happening in real time. And this is a practice that the platforms treat as, depending on what adjective you want, we could say, excuse me, we could say a secretive process, we could say a secure process, but long story short, the work is done in these very sterile, secure call center environments for a variety of reasons, including data protection of user data. So it became clear to me that were a quarantine to occur in a place like the Philippines, where there's this massive percentage of the workforce, there would be a major logistical hurdle. It's not a given, for example, that those workers could simply transition to an online work environment from home, as many of us have done overnight, because of those security issues, also because of infrastructural issues. So in a country like the Philippines, such as like the United States, there is a gross gulf of infrastructural development in parts of the country. That is to say that, in a particular infotech park in a part of Manila, there's massive bandwidth pipes, all the electricity one might need, and so on. That can't be presumed to be present in workers' homes. What was the alternative then? Well, based on my research, based on the work of reporting, based on many years of expertise just on this panel, I can tell you that AI tools are absolutely present. Computational tools are absolutely present in content moderation practice. But as some of us might suggest, there might be a few issues with those AI tools, with those computational tools, with the way that they adjudicate content when they're left to do that work without human intervention. I believe someone on this panel wrote an entire book about what those problems might be. I'm referring to Dr. Noble, of course. The firms themselves don't really rely upon those tools solely, for all the reasons we know, because they are blunt instruments, because they often require a second pass vetting of humans to take a look and say, okay, do we concur that these decisions were correct? They work seamlessly in some contexts, which we can talk about later, where and when and how they work well, but in others they don't. And so I knew there had to be a pretty serious panic going on in industry at that time about how to kind of be more reliant upon tools that were probably already in the production chain, but were not considered, kind of the fundamental bottom line production environment tools that would be unleashed under normal circumstances without worker intervention. At any rate, around March 13th, 16th, I can't remember the date, but about 2 months ago, Facebook did announce that it would be sending its content moderators home, and that was a global decision. They have centers in places like Austin. They have workers on site all over the place, Ireland, Berlin, all these places in the world, and also the Philippines. And so they made the announcement that they would be doing that, and they gave a very candid kind of I guess press release, but it was more like a post, a very candid post about, look, there are going to be some hiccups. This is not going to be flawless or seamless, as if commercial content moderation already was. It's not. But I think what was so fascinating about this, Joan, to just kind of wrap my comments and get back to your kind of framing question, is that over the last few years, so I've been in this field for a decade. I've been working on this topic for a decade. Early on, my work was to convince other people that this phenomenon happened. Okay, that people did not believe, and that is not because they're stupid. That's because they were led to not believe that humans intervened in this way online. over the past few years, starting in 2016, really, and I would pinpoint that and connect it to things like the election of Donald Trump. I would kind of direct the Brexit situation to this, other kinds of national elections and political crises around the world. All of those things coalesce to make users start questioning the ways in which information was circulating on the platforms they were using. And what happened was, for the first time, the platforms started acknowledging these human workers, and in so doing, the process and the phenomenon of commercial content moderation in general. And so to me, this situation of COVID is yet another moment in which lay people, let's say regular users, but also a host of others, including regulators, including critics, but others, have seen in relief, in a tangible way, the presence or absence of these people and the presence or absence of computational tools. It even has come in the form, in the case of Facebook and some other platforms, of when you go to report abusive content, being met with a notice that says, hey, we're short on staff. Hey, we're only dealing with the most acute problems. Instagram was doing that, for example. And so talk about a paradigm shift where we've gone from a fantasy of total computational governance online, whereas there was an entire, legion army of humans making decisions, to a tangible experience for users, for an average user, to understand that something goes on behind the scenes here, behind the screen, if you will, and it can't be done because of the presence or absence of humans to do the work. That's, to me, a phenomenal moment in the story of how social media is made, and its social and political context. And so I think I'll pitch it there.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sounds great. And so, my big takeaways from this, and I think you're right to say that there has been a paradigm shift, and we've had to recognize the fact that people work to make the internet happen, right? Like it's not as if, Facebook is on and they have no employees, right? People often imagine technology as kind of without people in a lot of ways, because it's easy to think about it as this sort of seamless process. And when you see those seams, when you see the infrastructural breakdown happen, of course, it's an opportunity, especially for researchers, to say, well, this is what we've been talking about all along. And, there are some kind of properties of technology that do tend to smooth over the idea that workers are involved, or that content moderation does require human judgment, right? That's a big deal. Sofia, I want to kick it over to you next to talk about sort of what's new in your world. I mean, you've been looking at these issues for at least a decade. You've got a bit of a history in digital marketing, so the underbelly of how the internet works and how these deals are brokered and to make things trend and to. But what are you seeing now that is different from the kinds of workflows and whatnot you've seen in the past related to your work on algorithms and how they surface and distribute information?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Joan. And I have to say, it's a really difficult day in my neighborhood right now. My neighbors are out at the same time that we're convening here, running for Ahmaud Arbery, and really trying to think about the consequences, once again, of the socialization of white Americans to fear Blackness and Black people. And, I'm acutely aware of the role, of course, that social media and the internet play in emboldening people to unabashedly harbor their resentments, fears, anxieties, and the like, resentments and racism toward Black people in this country and more broadly around the world. So it's a difficult moment, in fact, for us as we're gathering, not just because it's at the moment that we've lost another African American due to just, unprovoked, unfounded, racist violence, quite frankly. But, it occurs to me in this specific moment of the last, few days talking with Professor Roberts, that the consequences of digital media and social media as both the informers to the public of what's happening in the world, and also the kind of propagators of a whole host of racist and disinformative kinds of content are quite severe. So at a macro level, I've been thinking about, of course, we're all sheltering in place and thinking about the coronavirus and the way that at a moment where, quite frankly, all of us on this call have played such key roles with our colleagues around the world in really trying to destabilize the idea of the internet as a free speech zone, as a neutral, objective, vetted, credible space for ideas and certainly for truth or reliable information to flourish. I think all of us have really, every one of us on this call again and others have been, spending our careers over the past decade or more trying to unravel the disparate consequences of mis and disinformation, propaganda, racist propaganda, political propaganda in these spaces. And here we are in the middle of a pandemic where big tech is rushing in and, allegedly filling in the gaps or facilitating certain kinds of connectivity and access to information, but also profiting greatly from the spread of all kinds of nonsense and disinformation. And some of that disinformation comes from political actors, quite frankly. But the rate, the scale and speed, which I think, Elizabeth and Sarah, your work on helping us understand the speed and scale by which this kind of information can flourish. So, I'm writing right now about what it means at this particular moment as the economy is collapsing, as millions of people are unemployed and underemployed, as really important democratic institutions in our society are on the verge of collapsing. We've seen several colleges and universities close their doors. Schools are facing threats, libraries, all kinds of really important, what we think of as the democratic counterweights to big tech. These institutions are increasingly precarious as the pandemic rolls through the world. But here again, big tech to save the day, so to speak. And I'm writing about what does it mean that this particular dimension of the economy is seeing, increasing profits and are proposing more encroachment and more space to occupy and to keep us tethered to their platforms at a time when the consequences of that are severe, particularly because the content moderators are going home or have gone home, as Sarah's written about. And so I think this is a really important time. I'm watching, obviously, the news about Ahmaud Arbery and whether justice will prevail in the coming weeks and months for him. Certainly social media is going to play a huge role in that, just as it has for George Zimmerman, who murdered Trayvon Martin, the NYPD who killed Eric Garner, the many people that are suffering the consequences of, what I think of as a toxic environment, quite frankly, that emboldens people to bad behavior as well. And I think that there's no discounting the role that moderators play, for example, in making more visible the worst, or in having a kind of sensitivity and deep knowledge and awareness of what racist propaganda, for example, looks like, or what public health disinformation looks like. And these are, real issues. We're living in a moment where, we're watching important dimensions of democracy, public health, public media, public education, the cracks and fissures in these kinds of institutions. And, I think every day living here in California and LA, what would it have been like if for the last 20 years we had asked Silicon Valley to pay taxes and put money into the coffers for our society, like all the rest of us do as individuals? What would it have, how would it have been? Would my friend of 30 years, Lloyd Porter, not have died a few days ago from COVID-19 complications because there had been enough resources distributed into our healthcare system? So these things are very real. They're touching my life personally. And so these are the kinds of things that are on my mind and that I'm writing about and will be writing about here in the near future.
I appreciate that. And I'm, sorry to hear for your loss. And I think that one of the things that gets really underappreciated in this moment is just the waves and waves and waves of grief, right? Yes. That everybody's experiencing. And, and I've been thinking a lot about the work of Mary Gray right now, who's been looking at and trying to understand contact tracing and how tech wants to smooth out contact tracing using phone-to-phone contact without any humans involved. In her work on her book Ghost Work is something that continuously comes front of mind when I start to think about when do people disappear from the tech loop when we start to talk about tech and design. And I appreciate thinking through the ways in which Silicon Valley has been allowed to operate as an innovator, tethered by the sort of normal constraints of, the kind of taxation and the kind of public interest obligations that other different media organizations have. So without that designation of being a media organization, of course, they're able to do more and also stay sort of under the cover. Which is why I think, Elizabeth, your research reporting, your investigative reporting is something that really is phenomenal and is first in class. When I think about what do I want to know what's happening in Silicon Valley, I instantly go to your reporting. And so what are you seeing that's new and is piquing your interest now? And I really appreciate you coming in on your day off to talk to us. I know how difficult it is to get, people to leave you alone when you're at work. And then I come knocking and I'm like, can you just get on this webinar? So I appreciate it.
Well, Joan, thanks for having me here. And I did it because you've helped me so much just understand all of these issues in the last several years that, I feel like you're one of the people that I couldn't do my work without. And I should say same with the others on the call, Sarah especially. I've quoted a ton. Sophia, I've read through your work, so it's just it's really great to be with everyone, even in these sad times. And Sophia, I'm very sorry for your loss as well, and thank you for bringing up the current moment. Yeah, there's a lot to say. Echoing the others, that when I first started reporting on this, the companies wouldn't even tell me. So I remember this distinct moment where when right around the time this kind of started, there was this big sea change in how the tech giants perceive themselves around the crisis of Russian disinformation. So this was happening during the 2016 election, but it only came to light about a year later for lots of reasons that we've reported on. Facebook knew and observed it was happening shortly after the election, but they were putting the pieces together internally and didn't think that it would get as much outside scrutiny that it did. But because of Senator Warner and others really pushing, it eventually culminated in hearings. And I remember those hearings. It wasn't the hearing that Zuckerberg himself attended, but it was all the corporate lawyers, the general counsels of the companies of Facebook, Google, and Twitter. And they were coming to account for how Russians could have manipulated the platform. And, in Facebook especially, it was the gravest because it was like 89 million, it was over, actually, I don't want to misquote myself. It was tens of millions of Americans who were, I think 89 million was the number, who were touched by the Russian propaganda. But at the night before the hearing, I remember Facebook made this big announcement where they said, we are going to be hiring 10,000 more content moderators. And this was the first time that they had ever put a number to it, because for those of us that have been asking questions, you're like, wait, well, you never told us that you even had content moderators, let alone the number. And so the very next day I followed up. Mark said it Mark said it in the company's earnings call, which happened to coincide with the hearings. And by the way, those hearings didn't make a blip on their earnings. They still had great earnings that day. But they wouldn't tell me. After the call, I followed up and I said, well, where are these moderators located? And are they part-time or full-time workers? And they wouldn't tell me any of that. Since then, in the 3 years, that was 2017. Since then, they have gotten a lot more transparent about aspects of the work, and have even invited me when I was doing some stories and they saw there was pressure on. Twitter invited me to tour their content moderation. I went down to Austin and toured Facebook's content moderation offices there. Facebook has about equal numbers of people in the US, the Philippines, and India. Those are their largest sites. But because India is so large, India is dealing primarily with the Indian market, a local market. And the Americans, people on US time, deal with content from the US and English-speaking content, but also content from all over the world. And there's this irony that's not lost on anyone who works there, that Facebook as a company is largely male, white, and Asian. If you walk into a content moderation office, and in some cases, like for YouTube's, they're completely unmarked. They're on Google's computers, but they can't tell anyone they work for Google. In Facebook's, it was to the point where even though they worked in the Facebook building, a woman got reprimanded because she wanted to tell her friends that she had this cool job working in the Facebook building, and she tried to take a selfie of herself in front of the Facebook logo. And she was told, you cannot take a picture of yourself in front of the Facebook logo. You're not allowed to mention that you work. No one's allowed to mention that they work in this type of job on LinkedIn either. So there was this secrecy to the point where even though you're going into the cafeteria working with Facebook people every day, you can't even take a picture of yourself by the logo. So the content moderators in Austin, I toured their offices. But then after I did this tour, I remember for a while, I started hearing from people who knew I had done the tour and said, actually, it's not like what they told you it was. And even though the tour I did in 2019, so it was 2019, and so there was the fact that they were even giving a journalist a tour, and not only a tour, I got to meet with people, team leaders, and one of the things that was very interesting to me is even in the people who were Facebook and Accenture said you can meet with this journalist and talk, and it was on background, so I wasn't allowed to quote them directly, but I could by name, but I could quote them. Even the people who were really willing to talk about the job in front of their employer, which is kind of how honest can you be in front of your employer? Even those people were talking a lot about the PTSD. And I remember there was this one guy who said, he was a manager, so he'd been there for a while, enough to want to be a manager. And he said, yeah, I used to wake up at night. I used to have trouble falling asleep. Oh, everyone. I said, did you ever have nightmares? And he was like, of course. He was like, nightmares are part of having this job. And then he said that, and I said, what else? And he said, well, paranoia, like you think because you've seen so much violence on the internet, you've seen so much graphic imagery that it shows up in your dreams, or you walk around and you think somebody's going to jump you, like you get paranoid thoughts. He said in particular that he would go, or this person said that someone said at that meeting that they would go and constantly check their door to make sure it was locked. And what was really interesting is they were just talking about, the nightmares, in some cases, occasional panic attacks, that is just part of the job. And so one of the things that, no one denies, even Facebook. Like Facebook will always say, this is a very hard job. YouTube, this is a very, very hard job. Even so, and that there's a lot of acknowledgement that there's PTSD and conversation about PTSD, I think that where the conversation goes next is who is liable for the PTSD and the anxiety and the mental health problems and consequences that this job causes, and when will there be an accounting of it? And right now everything is completely private, so any information that we get about the consequences of the job is coming from our reporting, so it's totally anecdotal. It's not like we have a big number where we can say, but from my own reporting, and I also went to the Philippines. So when I talk to content moderators all over the US and a couple dozen in the Philippines, I would say about 10 to 20% of people we talked to had serious mental health consequences after the fact. And then another, and this is me anecdotal, with a sample size of 40 people. And then another, I want to say 15% or 20%, at least half, had some kind of psychological consequence, like a nightmare or paranoid ruminations. But those people would just say, I have no, especially in the Philippines where there's a culture of really being positive, people would say, oh, I love the job and it's fine and this and that. But then when you hear them describing, you're saying, well, under at least an American lens, this kind of psychological effect on someone would really be unacceptable. And there would have to be a lot more protections and precautions and just kind of reckoning with what that causes. And then so the US workers that I met with and the ones that later I spoke with, who contacted me after, who were pushing for more psychological protections. They were pushing for more break time, and also they were pushing for more money, because a lot of people are getting paid around between $16 and $18 an hour as contractors to do the work. And that is not enough, especially in a gentrifying city like Austin or in the Bay Area where people make a couple dollars more an hour. But it's to the point where many of the content moderators I talk to, like at least half of them, have other jobs. They live with roommates. They don't have enough money to live on their own. They work sometimes 2 and 3 jobs. So a lot of them are doing grocery delivery. They're working in the gig economy on the weekends. So if you just get the picture of somebody working 40 hours a week, seeing the ugliest stuff on the internet, suicides, beheadings, child pornography, really disturbing stuff, where you kind of need some downtime. And instead, on the weekends, instead of downtime, you are going to work as a grocery delivery person for Amazon Prime, or you're doing odd jobs to make more money. And so the last thing I'll say, Joan, since you asked just about what the latest is on this, what I heard from my sources very recently, and this hasn't been reported, we'll probably report it soon, is that Facebook is already asking the content moderators to come back to work. And I find this very interesting in that Facebook just said publicly this week that all their full-time employees will be able to work from home through 2020. For the content moderators who are contractors, who are working through many third-party contracting companies, they're already trying to incentivize people to come back to the office by paying people. I think what I heard is, like, if you work 20 hours right now, you'll be paid for 40 hours. And they are doing social distancing in the office, so you can't be next to somebody in a cubicle. So they are, I would say that, it's voluntary, you get paid more money, and people are following what seems to me to be pretty good health procedures. But it just shows you, like, Facebook is desperate to have them back, because you can't have 20 to 30,000 people essentially not working because they can't work from home, doing this job from home. You just can't make that up with technology, as the others have said. There was already a report of, there's been many reports actually of people who have seen anti-Semitic, racist, hate speech on Facebook, and they've reported it to Facebook, and they've gotten the message that I think Sofia or Sarah referred to, where the message says, sorry, we don't have enough people, this is a tough time. That's already happening. And then look at this video that went viral, in the last 2 days, this pandemic video, misinformation about a vaccine and about that the pandemic was planned. So this video, which Facebook said it would take down, well, we've already seen so many examples of that video popping right back up. And Joan, you write you write and talk so astutely about all the different tips, the tricks and tactics that misinformation operators and just bad actors employ to try to get their videos up when the videos get taken down. And they're doing that. And there's certainly going to be effect on health misinformation in the weeks ahead.
No, I appreciate the really in-depth analysis, bringing us forward and backward in time to think about what it used to look like, what we're seeing now. And, I feel like there's a scoop built in there about the enticing workers back in. But what's hard about that, and I think Sarah and Sofia probably want to jump in here, is to say that we don't know if because we cannot look, because we have no oversight, we can't know if it's Nike in the 80s, right? We can't know if there's actually what is happening is really what is, what is the reality that they're describing. And there's often sleight of hand, I think, with the ways in which these platform companies speak to the public, especially as they try to conceal how important the workforce is and how damaging the work is. I've had a few content moderators describe to me the most horrible thing they've ever seen. And I didn't even have to witness it, but my mind immediately goes to picturing it. And it's terrifying to think about that kind of imagery as part of your normal workflow. And I agree with you. The other thing that I want to...
Can I jump in to say one thing that's quick? Someone said it to me this way, that imagine going to work where once a week you see the most horrible thing you've ever seen.
Yeah. No, that it would be, sometimes that's how I feel about the work that we do on the technology and social change team. But it is, it's these things are actually pointed at them. And so the scale of horror that they go through is obviously just so much different. And the other piece that I think you said that's really important to understand is about racialized disinformation and what it is they're prioritizing right now. So they're prioritizing health misinformation because they know how easy it is for us to trace back when a user saw a particular piece of information, posted about it, and then ended up dying from drinking bleach or eating fish food that they thought was chloroquine. Like, they know the breadcrumb trails go right back to those people's social media posts, and we can see very clearly that they had witnessed health misinformation. And so it's for me, the racialized disinformation part of that has been something that I have been really, for the past several years, very focused on watching white nationalist organizing, watching different political operatives organize. And as Sofia's pointed out about the different targeting of Black Americans in this time, we did a earlier webinar with Brandy Collins Dexter that described how Black Americans were being, there was dangerous speculation that Black Americans were somehow immune to coronavirus related to melanin. And this was circulating pretty broadly. And we're gonna be, she's writing a report right now on that. And then, we've had Asian Americans advancing justice on, saying hate crimes are up and people are afraid to report hate crimes. And we knew going into an election year, of course, that the anti-immigration sentiment was going to be at an all-time high. We were going to be seeing lots and lots of disinformation related to that, targeting specifically Latinx and Hispanic communities, as Trump still, has this fantasy of building a wall. But I do want to switch gears a little bit and give you all a chance to, of that potpourri of issues I just put on the table, pick one to riff on. And if you could limit it to about 2 minutes so that we can get everybody's thoughts in. And I will start with you, Sarah, if you want to talk about what's front of mind from the themes that we've started to discuss here.
Yeah, I'll try to be concise, which everyone knows isn't my strong suit. But I'll just say that I think, what you've just done, Joan, is synthesize these issues into the broader fabric of a significant social breakdown that's been at play for several years, to say the least, at least. I remarked on Twitter the other day that I'd like to never hear anyone suggest to me again that science is undertaken in a vacuum and has no political implications, and vice versa. That politics isn't interested in politicizing and deploying science as weaponry in a variety of battles. And if there isn't an illustration of what I mean by that, greater than this pandemic, I don't know what is. I mean, I was chastened by someone on Twitter for bringing up my own experience in the 80s and 90s, living through the American AIDS crisis. I was told that AIDS isn't over, as if I don't know. But the point is that we have seen government use these medical crises. There's a long-lived history of this, particularly among Black Americans, which I'm sure we can speak to, of the government using a lack of care and of disinformation to further harm entire swaths of the population that it deems less than. So just as we saw in the 80s and 90s that the communities most profoundly affected by HIV/AIDS were gay communities, trans communities, communities of color, and economically underprivileged communities, and all of the intersections that might exist among those communities, so too are we seeing it now. There's no conspiracy there. We just have to look at the numbers, and we have to look at the targeting, and then we have to do the structural analyses to question, as Sofia pointed out, the fact that this is a nation that claims to be industrialized and first world, and yet in Los Angeles lets people die in the goddamn street. Okay, so some things aren't adding up here, and in an election year, in the federal, national presidential election, you better be certain that these issues are politicized. Now, to tie that back to tech and social media, we have CEOs and C-suite execs all across Silicon Valley who long ago drank the libertarian Kool-Aid and believe that what they are doing is somehow articulating freedom by refusing to take a political stance for or against some of these things that I've articulated, as if that refusal isn't in and of itself politics, right? So I don't know how some folks are sleeping right now at night. I know that the rank and file in the firms are pressed, as always, into service of solving these problems. But as I have articulated to those colleagues of mine in industry, you are going to always be hamstrung unless and until your leadership comes to Jesus, right? As they say in the South, or wakes up, or is simply replaced by some process that forces the hand of tech to articulate its position on these issues and then to take action. Clearly, if we wait around for that to happen, we're going to be waiting a long time. But within the firms themselves are these groups of people. Facebook is made up of do-gooders. It really is, of people who went to school for peace studies and diplomacy and law, and then come, that's sort of like the middle swath of policymakers there. And then we've got the execs and the high-level people who are about something else entirely. And what happens is a paradox. What happens is muddling, perhaps. This could be a time for tech companies to make a clarion call about refusal to accept some of this material on their platform. But here's the rub, right? That gets us back, and then I'll leave it. Here's the rub. Even if they did, how would they implement such policies writ large when their entire workforce, whom they've denied for a decade and are only recently starting to acknowledge, is absent?
Very true. So Sofia, you have some closing thoughts?
I'll just say that I think that this is a moment for a mass reevaluation vis-a-vis public policy as a way to enact change, the kinds of changes that we need in our society broadly. I really want to, I am thinking about in my own work right now and through our work together at UCLA about things like reparations and restoration. What does this sector owe to democracy, to democratic societies around the world, where it's so deeply implicated in their collapse, where it's so deeply implicated in the rise of racist and hateful speech and action and violence on a number of axes. I'm with Elizabeth. When I think about that kind of restoration or reparation that has to take place, I think that also includes the workers, the content moderators, who I also believe are disproportionately harmed based on their own identities. Having recently met a Black content moderator on social media and seeing the tremendous despair that he's experiencing. And I believe that journalists and academics need to also nuance what's happening among content moderators in terms of their own racialized, gendered, class identities, spaces that they occupy around the world. I can't imagine what it would be like to adjudicate racist, violent content, hateful content as a Black woman. I would last an hour. The complexities of the kind of atrocities that are happening, including calls for genocide against people in communities that you might belong to or identify with. There's a lot at stake right now around the world. And I think that, the workers have got to be prioritized. They are doing the frontline work on behalf of the rest of us. And we've got to figure out how to better create remedy. I'm particularly concerned, going back to, even the origin story of my book, that the work of the content moderators is also the work that informs machine learning. It's also the work that informs the so-called alleged AI that's going to come and replace them. And so what does it mean when you have a work stoppage, for example, for 6 months or a year of people who cannot, in fact, adjudicate content, who are already under-resourced to adjudicate it properly, and that those decisions and that adjudication helps inform the pattern recognition AI that is on the horizon. The whole system, soup to nuts, is broken. And, I guess the question is, and to one of the people who asked, as we see further media consolidation around the world, this shines a very bright light on why hyper-local media, ethnic newspapers, radio stations, public media are so incredibly important, because when you start consolidating media through companies like Facebook and Google at a global scale, you will, just answer Sarah's question, you will never be able to intervene upon it. And so maybe it's time for these companies to either be broken up or for us to have a reinvestment in public media to start.
Elizabeth, do you want to add some closing thoughts? Oh, you're muted. Here, I'll unmute you. Okay.
Sorry.
There you go. You're live.
Yeah, I know we have 2 minutes, so I'll be quick. My first thought is liability. When will the tech giants have to literally pay for the therapy and trauma, for the therapy and the trauma, not just at work, which they do, but months after the fact, years after they leave the job? I think it's going to be interesting. Like, will there be some liability lawsuits? Is that going to be like, what is their actual legal responsibility? Right now, they want to get kudos for doing all this voluntarily. We voluntarily give our workers access to therapy. We voluntarily give them lots of free time, which of course means they completely control how it is. But what about paying for external therapy? I mean, if PTSD were proven to be an absolute consequence of the job, I think that they would have more real liability around that. I think the other point I would make, and I've been writing about this in addition to this topic in the last few weeks, it's just that the pandemic makes the largest tech companies more powerful than almost any other company in the economy. They already are, but every trend that the pandemic accelerates or catalyzes actually helps these giant companies. The first one is, if you look at the kinds of companies that are failing, they're brick and mortar, real world companies, retail, boutiques, waiters and restaurants, things in the real world, the kinds of stuff that tech has been saying they want to automate for a long time. And so what's the point that's been made to me is that the pandemic overnight has kicked us into new habits. And those habits, we know, are not going to go back to what they were before the coronavirus. So with that power means what's going to happen to the antitrust investigations? What's going to happen to all the scrutiny that was on big tech? Those investigations, some of them are already slowed down because people are working from home. What happens to the California privacy law? There's just a lot of questions about the role that, already these companies were sort of in some ways untouchable, and that is going to grow. So this question of power. And then I guess lastly, to Sofia's point, I've always thought if the companies paid more attention to what the moderators said as well, they would develop different policies, because the moderators are largely dark-skinned people, Black and brown people, and women. They're more women moderators than men, is what everyone has told me in their offices, at least in the US. And so, and then Facebook is largely male and white and Asian. And it doesn't mean those are the only people making the policies, but you can see there's a gulf between what the rank and file think should be allowed on the platform, especially in around areas like hate speech and racist speech, and what the policies are. And so, there's really big gulf there between the people at the top who are making the decisions essentially to preserve the company and the people in the rank and file and what they think is right for moderation. I'll stop there.
So I want to say thank you to all of you, and I would be remiss to not acknowledge the fact that I didn't bring up the new Facebook Oversight Board on purpose, because I really wanted to have a conversation about and informed by research about what the workers are experiencing and what it means to study infrastructure. After hearing all of you, I wonder if this oversight board is going to become a proxy spokesperson for content moderators, and will, use their power and prestige and position to say that, this is where the quote unquote real content moderation decisions are being made. And it would further obfuscate what's happening, as Sarah eloquently puts it, behind the screen, where there are, tens of thousands of people every day making these decisions very quickly, and they are not being provided the services. So I think the most that we could begin to, the least we can begin to do is to push this oversight board to think about the digital labor involved, and to act accordingly, and to get those voices of content moderators into the mix. Sarah, you wanted to say one last thing?
Yeah, the one thing I was going to say was I was actually involved just about a year ago to the day. It was at the end of May. I was in New York City, involved in one of Facebook's oversight board convenings. And the thing that I brought up in that forum was, look, whatever gets decided here, was a room full of, law professors and that sort of folk. I said, whatever gets decided here is going to have an implication for implementation and production, which means workers, which means the lowest waged, lowest status workers. And I want to make sure that, number one, they're not going to get thrown under the bus in any kind of appellate scenario. But number two, that just the decision makers at the very top of this oversight board always recall that what they're doing will, that's where the rubber will meet the road. I don't know how that got taken up, but I did make that point, and then they were like, oh, Sarah's here.
Sarah, they're not taking up any labor issues. No. That's how that point got dealt with. The oversight board has no jurisdiction over labor issues.
Of course not. Of course not.
Yeah. So, well, unfortunately, we got to bring this to a close because other people got other places to go. But I could talk with you all for days. Sometimes we have. So, looking forward to the next time, and hope you all are well. And I'm missing the California sun, of course.
Yes.